Yep.
Okay, so we are going to be working on week 3, which is about the Indochina, or the first Indochina War, and just a little precursor to this whole thing. The entire course is on the Vietnam War, but it's very important to understand what happened in relationship with the legacy that the French left behind before the American involvement occurred in order to fully understand the Vietnam War. So first, I have to give you an accurate description of where French Indochina is and what it is. So pretty much it was established in October 1887, and all of these areas, so Cochinchina, Annam, and Tonkin, are all now modern-day Vietnam. So that was included in French Indochina, as well as the Kingdom of Cambodia. And after the Franco-Siamese War in 1893, Laos was also added to the region. It was initially it was the second most invested in colony for the French after Algeria. It had a lot of natural resources such as rice, coffee, and pepper, but it was a very exploited colony as well. So some of the issues were that they did not have much regard for the local people, and they also just encouraged the most money being exploited out of the colony. So one of the basic ways that they did this was heavy taxation on opium, alcohol, and salt, which they all brought into the colony. So it's pretty much a monopoly on those 3 goods. Salt, very useful, the alcohol and the opium did not help the local people very much. Then starting the turn of the 20th century, or when automobiles began to boom, this area is very well known for rubber. So rubber became exploited. So with World War II, as World War II is occurring, the French started to become strained, as well as the British, in their control of their colonies overseas. So they were starting to get nervous about French Indochina and the fact that local militias and local groups had a lot of nationalist fighters inside them. So one of the most prominent figures was Ho Chi Minh, who was educated in France, who was educated in Europe, all throughout Europe, the Soviet Union, and also China. So he had a lot of Western knowledge to bring to the area. So with that, Ho Chi Minh, this is just a general overview of him. But he was originally from an area inside French Indochina. He was given a very nice opportunity to work as a chef or a cook on a boat. So he actually ended up touring a lot of the world. And with that, he landed in France. He became educated in France more thoroughly, and he got involved in the communist parties in the 1920s. This led him to also learn about the Bolshevik Revolution, and he was very inspired by that. So a few years later, he also traveled into the Soviet Union. In 1930s, this allowed him to establish the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. And in light of the issues with World War II, he never really saw going back to French Indochina as a very prosperous or very beneficial to him, being that it was still under the French control. But in light of some of these issues, he felt it was probably the best moment for him to return to Vietnam, or just French Indochina where he was from, and to really kind of stir the nationalist ideas in the area. With this, he established the Viet Minh in 1940, which was in French Indochina. Another important thing that I felt was kind of relevant was the fact that, one, Ho Chi Minh is not his given name. He changed this starting around when he was in France and Soviet Union, and it actually means, roughly translated, to bringer of light. So he also got the nickname of Uncle Ho because he was so well loved in the area because he was a local. And one of the more interesting kind of intertwining moments with China that he occurred because he was trying to get the Chinese influence and Chinese support economically and military-wise, since they were so close to French Indochina, is when he was in China, he actually got swept up by Chiang Kai-shek's very anti-communist party, and he was detained for 18 months. So that kind of brings you into kind of the idea of what time period this is. So with this, Ho Chi Minh became a very influential figure with the help of one of his generals as well in Vietnam, and this is one of the most important quotes that I found. This is an open letter that he wrote to the people of Vietnam, and It's kind of strange to use the term Vietnam, being that it was a very modern day term for it, but the people in French Indochina to get them involved in the Viet Minh. And one of the most common things that the Vietnamese people later on became known for is their love for the quote that nothing is more precious than independence and liberty. So they really did have a lot of nationalist ideas, and they really were trying to fight against French Indochina. So this quote, which I took from Marilyn Young's book, which is on the course syllabus and in the reading for this week, is rich people, soldiers, workers, peasants, intellectuals, and women who warmly love your country. Let us unite together. He who has money will contribute his money. He who has strength will contribute his strength. And he who has talent will contribute his talent. I pledge to use all of my modest abilities to follow you, and ready for the last sacrifice. Revolutionary fighters, the hour is struck. The sacred call to the fatherland is resounding in your ears. So it's a pretty powerful letter that he wrote to the people, and it really did allow the Viet Minh to continue to grow. But the issue of the French imperialist powers in Vietnam and French Indochina was still an issue. So, with going into the ends of World War II and post-World War II, the French were forced out by the Japanese, and Vietnam and all of French Indochina was taken in as the Japanese greater East Asia coast prosperity sphere. So they wanted to take them under their belt. But they didn't want to destabilize the area because it was towards the end of the war and they didn't have that much resources. So they kept in place the French Emperor, Bao Dai, that was already appointed. They kind of appointed him because he was from the area, he was Western educated, and they just felt they could trust him. So it was very much a puppet organization for the French, but it worked. So there wasn't much revolt for a little while. So the Japanese, when they swept through, they kept him in place. The problem occurred when the Allied forces won in 1945, which led the Japanese to withdraw from the area, and that left the French-appointed Emperor Bao Dai with the colony alone, and no colonial rulers to really do anything. So this is when Vietnam calls for independence. This is when Ho Chi Minh and his leaders, and him as a leader and all of his people that followed him, thought that this was the moment for independence. The French had pulled out, the Japanese were out, and there wasn't much talk about coming back. So this almost moments after the Allied forces won the Second World War, President Ho called for independence. It's not known in the research whether or not he strategically did this or not, but he modeled it very much closely to the Declaration of Independence of the United States. He did call on the Western countries to kind of support his legitimacy, but all men are born equal. The Creator has given us inviolable rights, life, liberty, and happiness. So just the liberty and happiness kind of rings clear for an American historian. And these calls were sadly unanswered, and France stepped back in 1946. Soon after the end of World War II, they kind of saw the French swooping into the area again. French naval ships entered the realm of their ports again. So this is when the United States kind of struggles with what they were to do with Indochina, because they did hear the call for independence, but they also were kind of strapped down by their relationship with the French and the Western world. So what happened is Ho was actually part of the Communist Party in France in the 1920s, which continued to grow over the years, and even post-war, once French was reliberated, even post-war, it was very strong. And they feared, because of the Soviet Union being so close to this area, that if they were unable to gain control over French Indochina again, their economy would suffer, and they would fall to communism as well. And this is what the president threatened to the U.S. policymakers. So with this, he wrote, "We do not want to become communist. We do not want to fall into the Russian orbit, but I hope you will not push us into it." So it was a threat very much to the U.S. policymakers for how they were going to acknowledge Ho Chi Minh and his people and his independence. And then that is when the U.S. had to formally declare that they were going to help economically and military support for France in their kind of goal to reestablish reigns on Indochina. And this is when the war breaks out, because almost immediately when the French leave and the Japanese surrender and they leave as well, leaving Emperor Bao Dai, the Viet Minh, under the leadership of Giap, who was one of the most famous generals of the time, they saw this as their moment to strike. So they bombarded Hanoi, which is the northern city of Vietnam, and they pretty much formed the DRV. So Ho and Viet Minh began to build up the economy and military of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. So they established their area in the north, which led to the French scrambling when they returned to gain power. So they ended up establishing Vietnam, which was South Vietnam. So you don't get confused in the next couple of slides about how this interaction worked. So the French were in Saigon, which is South Vietnam, and they were in Saigon, and the Viet Minh and Ho were establishing. Ho was established as president, and they were in the north. And this led to years and years of war, but originally the French reassigned Bao Dai, just because he's been in the area before. They thought that he could reestablish kind of some relationships, but that didn't work. And even though Ho and all the French leaders that were in the area, the French officials, tried their best to negotiate peace, and they wanted to keep it peaceful, Ho Chi Minh's goals obviously were to get the French out and to make them really respect their independence, which did not happen because Ho and his, the Viet Minh forces and the French patrolling got into a little bit of a dispute. So the people on the ground were not respecting the leaders of the time, which meant they kind of got drawn into a war and a bigger conflict, which went on for years and ended with the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. So this battle was a 56-day long battle, and this is when the North Vietnamese and Ho Chi Minh actually established that they were able to fight against the French in this area. This was home turf, much like the American kind of views on it. It was very difficult terrain to fight, and the French were not prepared to really hold up their side of the battle, and they also did not have the money to sustain it after World War II. So with all their colonies around the world that were kind of revolting at this time, they didn't have the ability to really invest enough money in this. So in March 1954, the final battle between the French and the Vietnamese ended in a decisive victory for the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. After a 56-day battle, the French finally surrendered and failed to contain the nationalists in Indochina. And then this is when Ho and his men realized that the decision was not up to them about what happened next. The decision was up to the Geneva Accord. They sat together, and Ho was actually not present at this. He sent one of his main officials there because he feared being captured if he did leave. But he realized that a world frozen in Cold War was not one in which the colonies might fight against the colonial power and win an uncomplicated independence. I thought this was a pretty powerful quote because they finally were able to defeat the French and make the French realize that this was their area. They were claiming independence and nationalism, and they had such a following, and yet they still weren't able to claim independence at the end of this. More recently, it's the 60th anniversary of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which I'm going to go to actually later. I'll show you that in a second. But these are just some of the pictures that I found. This is a Viet Minh soldier or a Vietnamese soldier during the battle. And then this was also a very powerful picture that was taken after it. This is the Vietnamese soldiers bringing the French prisoners of war to the camp in Dien Bien Phu. So it shows how much, and I think it's so important because you're looking at all these men and the difference between their preparedness or I guess the Western idea of a soldier, and they have their local version as well. So it showed they had a lot of prisoners of war. So then it comes to the Geneva Accords, and this is when a lot of Ho Chi Minh and a lot of his men became very disgruntled with what was going on because he sent an advisor to the conference, but he didn't really have that much say in what was happening. He just sat there while the French, the U.S., and a lot of other groups decided their fate for them to make sure that they were stable enough. So after this, I found a pretty great video of I found a pretty great video of the Secretary of State, John Foster, at the time after the defeat of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, of him talking about how the U.S. was going to decide the Vietnam's fate. So.
See this melody.
Yeah. Okay. Pardon me, teacher. But yeah, I found this recently, and I just felt it was something important to add because it was kind of shocking that even though they did defeat them in May 7th in 1954, there was still so much far.
You knew you could make this holiday a little more merry, a little more jolly. What if you could even make it a little more magical? Well, Michaels is here to help. We're a place filled with possibilities and wonderful one.
Okay, so this kind of really just sets up for the Geneva Accords. This is prior to the Geneva Accords, but this was him discussing what was actually going to happen soon. So this is the Secretary of State's mindset going into these meetings about...
Hours ago, Dien Bien Phu is fallen. Its defense of 57 days and nights will go down in history as one of the most heroic of all time. The defenders, composed of French and native forces, inflicted staggering losses on the enemy, and the French soldiers showed that they had not lost either the will or the skill to fight, even under the most terrible conditions. And it showed that Vietnam can produce soldiers who have the qualities needed to enable them to defend their country. An epic battle is ended, but great causes have before now been won out of lost battles. The Chinese communists have been supplying the forces of the Vietnamese rebels with munitions and trucks and anti-aircraft guns, radar, technical equipment, and technical advisors. They have, however, stopped short of open armed intervention. And in this respect, they may have been deterred by the warnings which the United States has given that such open intervention would lead to grave consequences which might not be confined to Indochina. Accordingly, we are ready to take part with the other countries principally concerned in an examination of the possibility of establishing a collective defense within the framework of the Charter of the United Nations to seek the peace, security, and freedom of Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific.
Okay, so one, just his language and the way that he speaks of it, saying the enemy. So it just shows the side that the French fought valiantly towards the enemy. But I did really respect the way that he said that the Vietnamese did show that they had enough force and enough will to defend their own country. So it is, in a way, the first time that it was really respected. Ho and the Vietnamese were really on a world premiere, respected, and just called out for being able to defend their own land. So this is the outcome of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, but as we all know, this is what stirs the American into their involvement in that, what we call the Vietnam War, but I've read a lot in my history of the Second Indochina War. So that is my lecture.
All right. Here's my question. Based on your study on this area, Ho Chi Minh is a very popular leader at the time, and he joined a communist party in France, but he regarded himself sometimes not as a communist, but rather nationalist. What is your opinion about it?
My opinion is that I wouldn't call him a communist either. I think that he was led towards communist ideals, but the Soviet Union and China tried their hardest to really beat the communism into him. But if you actually look at what he deployed on the ground, it was not communist. It was just more of I guess his way of like really leading the people. But there's a lot of studies out there, and even there's a lot of primary sources of U.S. like officials and U.S. policymakers like really asking that question: is he a communist? Because it was very unclear. It wasn't unclear that his military official Giap was communist, because he was. He had lots of ties to the Soviet Union, but Ho Chi Minh himself was not. I would say no.
Was Dien Bien Phu the place where the Americans eventually attacked?
I think later on it was another strategic battle for the Vietnam War, but
Yeah.
this was mostly a really important moment for.
Yeah, I meant like the 70s when
Yeah.
when the Americans invaded.
Yeah, the Americans were all over. There was a lot of battles. Yes.
Yeah, so it seems like even like way before all of this, like he was already heavily involved with like Europe, like in his studies, and like was, I mean, even back like at the Paris Peace Conference, like he went in like after World War I, and like the
Yeah.
only defense of it rejected him, and like
Yeah.
that, they didn't even want to see him, or?
Yeah, well, that's the interesting part, because a lot of these people in the Paris Peace Corps, they felt a lot of these nationalist leaders went there, and when the decision came out that like, yes, independence, all this, when the decision came out, they felt that this was regarded to them as well. And it was pretty shocking when they were like, oh no, not you, not Indochina, not certain areas in Africa. It was very alarming for them, and that's when he did get very frustrated. That, and then again in Geneva, to have to hear that, yes, you still aren't your own country, like we're gonna split. It was pretty much what happened after is Vietnam was split at a 17th parallel, and it was South Vietnam and North Vietnam. And Ho Chi Minh was obviously still the president, and there is a lot more lively, like active participation in that government. And then the South Vietnamese, they had Diem, who was not very was not a very respected leader. It was a puppet organization again. So it just shows that it wasn't what the people wanted, which led to further conflict in the American Vietnam War.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay.